Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas politics and the future of independence in the state of Texas. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that may be on the minds of some of you folks, but we're hearing more and more lately. What happens to Texas electoral votes when we leave the Union? You know, the Electoral College is a key feature of the U.S. presidential elections, and Texas' 40 votes are a significant factor in determining the next occupant of the White House. But if Texas decides to become an independent nation through TEXIT, what happens to those votes? How does that impact the rest of the country in future elections? So stick with me as we take an in-depth look at the political consequences of Texas leaving the Union and address some of the alarmist claims you might have heard from Texas opponents. Well, today is going to be kind of a fun one for me. One of the things that I love doing more than anything else is just destroying misconceptions about the concept of Texas independence. And it runs the gamut. TEXIT will cause a civil war. TEXIT means that grandma's going to die in a ditch because she's not going to get her Social Security. I mean, it's those things. TEXIT is unconstitutional. I love destroying misconceptions. And one of the misconceptions that is obviously making the rounds right now because the presidential election is on the horizon is the idea that somehow Texas withdrawing from the Union will mean that Texas will be a Democratic stronghold for the next 500 years. Well, let's be honest. It's not like the United States as an institution is going to last another 500 years. But the point here is that it betrays a fundamental lack of understanding about what the Electoral College is. I mean, look, you hear it all the time. You've got people, the ultra radical progressives talking about wanting to abolish the Electoral College. And part of the reason they want to abolish the Electoral College is they really don't understand what it is. They think that somehow that the United States as an institution is a pure democracy, which, I would suggest that they probably spend a little less time in their safe space cry rooms and maybe go crack a history book or a civics textbook or a government textbook, right? But the fact of the matter is that it's abundantly clear. The Electoral College is one of the last vestiges of the United States being what it was originally intended, which is a union of self-governing independent states, right? So as we go through this today, what I'm going to do is I'm really going to just kind of break it down into pieces. First, I've got to talk about what the Electoral College is, because even people that should know better don't, right? We're going to talk about why it was created, how it works, talk about some of the rationale behind why it even exists and why it is still a crucial part of the United States political system, right? So then we're going to dive into what happens when Texas withdraws. What happens to its 40 electoral votes? Some people just think they disappear, but that's not true. They're redistributed. So we're going to talk about that, why this process wouldn't throw the political system into chaos. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back it up with data, right? I'm going to show what those redistributed electoral votes would have done to affect the outcome of the last several presidential elections, right? And so we're going to debunk a lot of these alarmist predictions, primarily from TEXIT opponents and primarily Republican TEXIT opponents. I mean, I've heard it more times than I care to recount. But we're going to address that today. So, look, let's jump off. Let's talk about what the Electoral College is. And so to really grasp why the 40 electoral votes that Texas currently has are so important to people, we got to take a closer look at what the Electoral College is, how it works, and why it was created. So to do that, you got to go all the way back to 1787, to the Constitutional Convention. And by the way, for my historian friends out there, this is not an exhaustive course on the creation of the Electoral College. I'm not doing a 4-hour podcast, nor am I holding a semester-long course. I got to hit the high points here. So please keep your hate mail to a minimum. I already have enough as it is. But you're going to want to go all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, right? So Articles of Confederation, they're ready to ditch it. They decide they're going to write a new constitution and secede from the union that was created by the Articles of Confederation to join this new one. But during the deliberation process, there were a lot of competing ideas for how the president should be chosen. I mean, you got to remember, there were some people during that Constitutional Convention that, I mean, there was a popular sentiment that maybe the United States needed a monarch, right? I mean, that's where they were at discussing the fundamental level of governance. Now, some of the delegates wanted Congress to elect the president, and others argued for a direct popular vote by the people. Okay, so when you hear this argument about eliminating the Electoral College and, direct popular vote, understand this goes all the way back to the foundation of the Union, right? But part of the problem here was that, you had many of the founders and the framers, including James Madison, that really worried that a direct popular vote could lead to a tyranny of the majority. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. The more and more that the United States as an institution has gravitated toward that concept, what have you seen? You've seen the accumulation of tyranny in the federal government, empowered ultimately by, votes of the people, right? I mean, that's a whole other podcast. We can talk about that. But the bottom line is, these folks, sort of in that Madison view, recognize that larger states with bigger populations would easily dominate the elections, the federal elections. And basically the smaller states, the less populated states, wouldn't have a significant voice. If that argument sounds familiar, understand that that's a conversation that's happening inside of Texas right now related to the rural-urban divide. You've got places and counties in Texas that are sparsely populated, but there's a concentration of power, right? We understand that about 78% of registered voters in Texas are located in between 30 and 35 counties, right? So this idea of structuring governance is happening right now. So what they wanted to do as part of the Constitution, they came up with this compromise, right? They wanted to prevent the imbalance. So they designed the Electoral College so that each and every state had a say in choosing the president, regardless of its size. And so it really blended both the federal and popular elements into one. Now, a little commentary about this, I think, is necessary, because ultimately, and you heard me say this at the very beginning of the podcast, this is one of the last vestiges of the original concept of what the Union was, a union of several states. And so the compromise position was to give create this Electoral College and give a piece of the vote based off of Senate representation, which was a representation of the states, and then representation of the people from the states. Okay. That's how it was done. And then the Electoral College votes. Well, we'll get into that. But right. So let's just talk about how it actually works, and it'll make sense. So essentially, each state gets assigned a number of electors that are equal to the total number of its congressional delegation. Okay. So when I say Congress, understand I don't just mean House of Representatives. I mean House of Representatives and the Senate seat. So that means that the total number of a state's electors are determined by the number of seats it holds in the House of Representatives on the federal side, plus 2 additional votes to account for its Senate seats. So there are 435 seats in the House and 100 seats in the Senate. And so that brings the total number of electors to 535. Now, Washington, D.C., which isn't a state, is given 3 electoral votes. That came about under the 23rd Amendment. So that's why you have an overall total of 538 electors. Now, To win, you guys know this, it's first past the post. To win, the presidential candidate's got to secure a majority of these electoral votes to be able to win the presidency. Okay, so you're going to see as we approach the election that night, they're going to hold up a board and they're going to show which candidate won which state and how many electoral votes that is. And you will see the graph where on one side you've got, one candidate and on the other side you've got another. And in the middle, you've got that magic number, right, that secures the majority, which is 270. Okay. So, this is, if you're going to break it down further, understand that the number of House seats each state gets, because you'd be surprised how many people don't know why different states have different numbers of representatives in the House of Representatives. But the number of House seats each state gets is based on its population. So it's why large states like California and Texas have so many electoral votes. California has 54 electoral votes. It's got the most out of any state in the union. Texas, we got 40 electoral votes. We're second in the number of electoral votes we have. And that is 38 from our House seats and 2 from our Senate representation. Now, these numbers change because they're based on population. These numbers can change every 10 years because of the U.S. Census, right? Which again adjusts the apportionment of House seats based on the shifts in population. So some states lose population, some states grow, but whatever that balance looks like, that's how many seats you get. However, the Senate seats remain fixed at 2 for every single state. So, the framers of the Constitution, they believe that this system would effectively ensure that smaller states like Wyoming and Vermont and New Hampshire wouldn't be overshadowed by larger states like New York or California, right? The Electoral College was essentially seen as a way to balance state and federal interests. It combined those elements of the popular vote with a system that gave the smaller states more leverage, at least in the selection of a president, right? So practically speaking, it intends to force presidential candidates to build broad-based support from across the country rather than focusing solely on populous regions or urban centers, right? Remove the Electoral College from the equation, and what do you have? Well, all you got to do is go win like New York City and LA, and, maybe Houston. And then guess what? You've won. Nobody else gets a say, right? You could literally just have candidates without the Electoral College focus on just a handful of the populated states. And, literally you're going to wind up with about 46 of the states effectively being flyover states that no candidate would ever spend a dime in because they wouldn't need to, right? But with the Electoral College, you got smaller states like Montana or New Hampshire that actually have a say in determining the outcome, okay? So, the understanding about this is that in theory and in practice, it works, right? It's a system that works. In fact, when Ted Cruz was asked a few years ago about what one of his red lines was for him to support TEXIT, he talked about the abolition of the Electoral College, right? It becomes kind of a red line at that point because without the Electoral College, what you essentially have is again, a tyranny of the majority, but a tyranny of a majority that is located in very concentrated areas where these, frankly, these large urban areas are going to dictate how we are governed, and I think that goes hand in hand with this idea of the imperial presidency. How much power has been accumulated in the hands of the president or the hands of the executive branch, right? That's, again, another conversation that we could have about how it's really not the president that matters. It's the executive branch. And frankly, it's the civil service, the 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats behind it. But because of this, right, this whole idea, this back and forth polarization that we've got right now, we hear these voices, like I said earlier, particularly of the Republican persuasion, and particularly for people outside of Texas that say, okay, well, look, Texas has 40 electoral votes, and if we don't have those, then there'll never be a Republican elected again. So, what we got to do is we got to talk about, look, post TEXIT, what happens, right? Do those 40 electoral votes just evaporate, and you're now left with, whatever the total is, 270 minus 40, from that midway point, the 535, 538 minus 40. So is that what you're left with? Well, absolutely not, right? So we have to talk about really what happens to those 40 electoral votes post Texit, right? So, let's just kind of get the lay of the land here, right? As I said earlier, Texas has 38 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, and then we get 2 Senate-based votes, giving us a total of 40 electoral votes. Now, important to understand is that Texas leaves the Union, 2 of those votes evaporate, right? Because they're Senate-based, and Texas won't be in the Union, so 2 of them go away. But what about the other 38, right? Well, they don't evaporate. They get redistributed among the remaining 49 states. Okay, so let's explain this part of it, because some folks, as I've tried to explain it previously, just didn't get why that is. So I'm going to take you all the way back to a law called the Reapportionment Act of 1929, which fixed the total number of representatives in the U.S. House at 435. Okay. It's a weird number. I get it. But what they did was they put a pin in the map, and they said, and that, again, a whole other conversation to have about whether it truly is representative. But that's essentially what they did. They said in 1929, look, we're not growing this thing anymore. We're going to just pin it at 435, and we are going to distribute those 435 seats based on the population of the states. So as the population grew, every 10 years you had a census, and those seats got distributed among the states. And you got to remember, from, in 1929, there were not 50 states, right? I mean, Alaska and Hawaii hadn't even become states yet. Okay. So, so that 435 became fixed, and those numbers were divided among the states based off of population. Okay. So because that happens, right? That normally happens every 10 years. Let's say Texans go to the polls and they vote in 2025 to withdraw from the Union. Well, guess what happens? Well, their 38 House-based electoral votes, right? First off, their House seats would be redistributed to other states, because we're not going to need them, right? We're going to be a self-governing independent nation, right? The two Senate seats would disappear. Our Senate delegation would not be there anymore. But those 38 House seats are going to get distributed among the other states that remain in the Union. Okay, so what that also means is, so do the electoral votes, right? Because that component of the number of electoral votes that Texas has, those 38, will be redistributed based off of where those House seats are redistributed. Okay. So who's going to benefit from that, right? And this is going to play directly to some of the objection, some of the fear that people have. So obviously, if you're doing that, let's look at California. California is going to get some, and I know that's going to frighten people, but out of those 38, they're going to gain probably 6 additional seats, depending on whether or not California continues to hemorrhage population, right? But let's just say, for the sake of this, they're going to gain about 6 additional seats if things stay the same. Florida is going to pick up 4, right? Where Governor Ron DeSantis is. Florida's going to pick up 4. New York, if they're also not continuing to hemorrhage people, all things as they are, going to pick up probably 3 seats, somewhere in that ballpark. Okay. But it's not just these Democrat-leaning states that are going to gain, right? Most of the gains in the distribution of those 38 will happen in the South and West, right? We talked about Florida. But also you've got states like Ohio and Georgia and North Carolina and Michigan, which are all competitive states, are going to gain one seat each, which is going to give them one more electoral vote. And then you're going to see the remaining, what's going to happen to the rest of them? Well, you're going to see those distributed in states like Pennsylvania, Illinois, um, probably could gain 2 seats apiece. Mid-sized states like Virginia, Arizona, Tennessee would likely gain some of the remaining seats. So, you've got this distribution as the system rebalances itself. But, what I heard in that list were states that are, generally speaking, not what you would call Democratic strongholds. They're either Republican leaning or battleground states, right? So, I mean, let's talk about what that balance would look like. Well, we already said California and New York are going to see an increase in their electoral votes, so they're definitely going to continue to be Democratic strongholds. But what happens with Republican leaning states? Well, it's the offset. It's essentially some of the same situation that you've got right now, right? Where Florida and Georgia are going to gain more influence. You're going to offset Democratic gains in some of these other areas. And Florida, with its booming population, as people flee some of these liberal bastions and flow into places like Texas and Florida, Florida will probably continue to gain in population and become even redder than it already is. So what we're saying here is you take Texas out of the equation and you see that redistribution. It doesn't just all of a sudden all of these Democratic states get those electoral votes, or all these Republican states get all those votes. They get redistributed. So it's pretty interesting. Now the one thing is, and I mentioned this a moment ago, that the Senate-based votes go away. So Texas 2 electoral votes that are tied to its Senate seats will not be redistributed because they're fixed at 2 per state, regardless of population. So what that will do is it will drop the total number of electors in the Electoral College from 538 to 536. But those 38 House-based votes, they're going to be absorbed by other states, keeping the number of House seats representing the Electoral College at 435. So, it causes a shift. They shift around, but destabilizing the system or locking one party in or another, no, that's not what's going to do that, right? The system is not going to collapse when a state leaves. I mean, you've got to remember, with populations fleeing those particular states that are pursuing more progressive policies that definitely are helping to usher Texas out the door. People are fleeing to states that naturally match their values, and so that number is going to shift anyway. We saw massive gains from net in-migration during this last census. So, first census out of the gate, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But for future elections, this is where things get interesting, because it really is important to take this and show practically what the outcome would be, because that's what people keep arguing. And I say arguing, they don't. They throw out this dismissive statement about Texas leaving the Union would mean that the Democrats would hold the White House for the next 1,000 years, or whatever ridiculous nonsense. And they literally don't say a thing to back it up. Okay. So look, it's often, it's often important to really take numbers like this, and let's just run the numbers. Let's just see what that looks like, right? So the best way we can do this is to say, okay, look, let's just take it as it is and apply those answers, right? That redistribution, Texas not being in the equation, to what happened in the previous presidential election cycles. Now, I know there's been some population change. We had the census, we had redistricting, but let's just, taking that out of the equation, let's just take a look at what the previous presidential elections would have looked like without Texas in the mix and those votes being redistributed. Well, let's go back to the one that we just had. Let's look at 2020 and all of the discussion about about, how that election was conducted aside, let's just look at what that does, what the redistribution would have done to the electoral votes. Well, with the redistribution in place, Biden's final total would have been 320 electoral votes, and Trump would have had 2016. So, or excuse me, 2016. See, I'm getting ahead of myself. He would have had 216, right? So, what's the result? Well, the result is no change. Biden still wins the election. The outcome stands, right? Well, go back to 2016, right? Trump versus Clinton. Trump would have won 304, or, well, in the race, he won 304, and Clinton got 227. But if you take Texas out of the equation, Trump would have ended up with 278 electoral votes, and Clinton would have had 258. Guess what? The result? Absolutely no change. Trump still wins, right? Despite all this talk about disruption, the outcome is exactly the same. Don't believe me? Let's roll back to 2012, right? Barack Obama, 2012 election. They ran him against Mitt Romney, or they ran Mitt Romney against him. I mean, what a joke, right? But 332 to 206, right? Obama won. But what's the shift? Take Texas out, redistribute those electoral votes. What does that look like? Well, Obama would have had 347 and Romney would have decreased to 189. Guess what? The result didn't change. Obama still won. Still don't believe me? Let's go back to 2008. I promise I'm not going all the way back to George Washington. I'm not doing that, right? But just to put a fine point on this, right? Final one. We're gonna go back to 2008. So Obama, McCain, right? Again, McCain, not a great presidential candidate, right? But Obama beats McCain 365 to 173, right? But you take Texas out of the mix, you redistribute those electoral votes, and what did you get? Well, you'd have had Obama at 380 and McCain would have been at 156. The outcome, yeah, okay, so McCain got less, but the outcome remains the same. Obama wins. You see, it's less about what the spread is between them and more about who crosses the threshold. The outcome remained the same, right? So you've got two elections right there. Well, 3 out of the 4 Democrats won, and Texas being in the union or out of the union made zero difference in that. You've got one where the Republican won, and Texas being in the union or out of the union made absolutely no difference as to the outcome. None whatsoever. Right? So, I mean, look, the bottom line here is just absolutely simple. Despite these alarmist, hair on fire claims made by Texas opponents, the redistribution of Texas electoral votes doesn't change the outcomes of recent presidential elections. And there is no reason to believe, based off of the math, right? Because it ain't going to lie. There's no reason to believe that it would change any of the future ones, where only 49 states are participating, because all of those electoral votes, minus the 2, are absorbed by other states. Look, if you're concerned about the electoral system in the United States reflecting, the way that your state wants to govern itself, you got 2 options. Either get better candidates or leave the union. I mean, that's your 2 options. Because right now, I'm pretty certain the handwriting is on the wall that there is no fixing the federal government, and that there is no way in the world that how you're represented in Washington, D.C. will ever be truly reflective of who you are as a people. It's just not that way. You have a political establishment versus the people. And if you're expecting the political establishment to conform and through its electoral system, then you're just kind of out of luck, right? But I want to shift our focus for the moment, because the real question isn't what happens to U.S. elections. It's about what happens to Texas. Remember, this is the Texas News Podcast. I am president of the Texas Nationalist Movement. We are talking about TEXIT. And while I appreciate the predicament that other states are in, they have the opportunity and the ability to do what we're doing, just as I described, right? And so, like I said, the real question isn't about what happens to U.S. elections. It's about what happens to Texas. And TEXIT is about Texas reclaiming its independence, controlling our future, leaving behind a federal system that no longer serves our interests, right? The impact on U.S. elections, as we've seen, is minimal. The real impact here for what we're doing is on Texans and their future. TEXIT is not about disrupting U.S. elections. I couldn't possibly care less, right? It's about restoring Texas sovereignty and allowing Texans to decide what's best for themselves without interference from the Washington District of Criminals, right? And while U.S. elections are going to go on with redistributed votes, Texas will step forward as an independent nation, right? They will continue to have their elections and they will have their redistributed votes, and those outcomes will be those outcomes. But Texas will be a self-governing independent nation. That's what matters here. The outcome of presidential elections doesn't change with Texas out of the picture. But for Texans, everything changes. We reclaim control of our borders, our laws, our resources, and most importantly, our future. TEXIT isn't about influencing who sits in the White House. Ultimately, that doesn't matter because you're not going to get a chance to vote for the 2.5 million unelected federal bureaucrats that aren't on the ballot. No, TEXIT is about ensuring that the decisions that shape our lives are made here in Texas by Texans for Texans. So, when opponents of TEXIT say that Texas leaving will create some uncertainty in the elections or create a deadlock for one part or the other, it's a scare tactic or it's ignorance, right? The truth is, TEXIT doesn't change those federal election results. It just doesn't. But what it does do is it gives Texas a chance to finally stand as an independent nation once again, right? As we look forward, it's important to keep in mind that what happens with the federal government is a matter for the states that choose to remain in the union. But for Texas, our focus is on taking back control of our future. We can give Texans the ability to govern our state according to our own values and interests, free from that outside influence. Our future is about self-determination. And what happens to the federal system post-Texit should offer us very little concern. Okay. But here's the bottom line, and I really hope that helps dispel some of that misconception, right? This idea that somehow Texas is just going to throw the United States into some Maoist Marxist chaos. Well, guess what, guys? That's kind of where it's already headed, right? I mean, it's there in some aspects, but I mean, it's pedal to the metal, headed for that cliff. And so, ultimately, it's almost like the Social Security question. Well, what's going to happen to Social Security? Well, why are you asking us that? Why don't you ask the federal government, who are intent on bankrupting it and letting grandma die in a ditch anyway? Well, this Electoral College situation is very similar, right? But the good news is for everyone, when you come across this piece of misinformation from people, you are now equipped to understand that distribution and what that looks like. And now you're armed with the facts that Texas in or out of the union won't have any effect on those presidential elections whatsoever. Okay. So look, heavy topic, but a fun one, very timely, and very excited to do it. And that, my friends, is going to be a wrap for the Texas News Podcast for this week. Look, I want to remind you, as I said before, like and share, leave comments, do all those cool things, because it really helps us get the word out there. And, things like episodes like this, where we get to dispel and destroy misinformation, those things are extremely helpful, not just to you, but to the movement as a whole, right? So, look, I'm going to encourage you right now. If any of this resonates with you whatsoever, if you are ready to see Texas become a self-governing independent nation, then you've got to be a part of the movement. You've got to come join us and help make this thing happen. Become a member of the Texas Nationalist Movement today. Head to tnm.me/join. and get started. Look, you can become a member for as little as $4.21 a month. I mean, it is. It's ridiculous how inexpensive we have made it, but we need you to be a part. Additionally, you need to stay informed, right? Subscribe to this podcast. Go visit the TNM News at news.tnm.me. We are just, we're out here making it happen. And as we head into the next legislative session, it is more important for you to get informed, and stay engaged than ever. And of course, look, as always, talk to your neighbors, friends, and family about TEXIT. I mean, this has to be top of mind for everyone. Your involvement makes a difference. And so together, we can make TEXIT a reality and ensure that Texas stands tall as a self-governing, independent nation once again. So, look, I really want to thank you for joining me on the Texas News Podcast today. We covered a lot of ground and very good one. Ultimately, really, all of this is going to be in your hands, and what impact this has, not just here in Texas, but in the rest of the states of the United States. So I'm going to leave you with the words that I leave you with every single time we're together. They're not my words, they're the words of Sam Houston when he said, Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?